There's a smell that clings to the 84th floor of the Reynolds building after midnight. It's supposed to be industrial lemon and bleach, but the night staff knows better. Beneath the ammonia is something sweeter, heavy, and desperate, carrying the undeniable scent of an expectant omega. They also know whose name is on the lease, and exactly whose sharp jawline the janitor's unborn child is going to inherit. They just never thought the CEO would step out of the private elevator and catch him scrubbing the marble. The mop bucket had a broken caster. It pulled to the left, squeaking with the rhythmic, high-pitched whine of a dying mouse every time Arthur pushed it down the long stretch of executive suites. He hated that sound. It scraped at the inside of his skull, right behind his eyes, adding to the dull throb that had been living there since his second trimester. Arthur leaned his weight against the plastic handle, pausing to catch his breath. The air up here was aggressively conditioned, stripped of humidity and warmth, but sweat still slicked the back of his neck. It pooled under the collar of his stiff gray uniform shirt. The fabric was 2 sizes too big, a deliberate choice he'd made 4 months ago when the flat plane of his stomach had first begun to round. Now, at nearly 7 months, the cheap cotton stretched taut over the hard, low swell of his belly. He pressed a rubber-gloved hand against the small of his back, digging his thumb into a knot of muscle that felt like hot wire. Just 3 more offices. The baby kicked. It wasn't a gentle flutter. It was a sharp, bruised thud right against his bladder. Arthur let out a short, harsh breath, his grip tightening on the mop handle until his knuckles went white beneath the yellow latex. "Yeah, I know," he muttered to the empty hallway. His voice was gravelly, unused. "I'm tired too. Deal with it." He didn't sound maternal. He didn't feel maternal. He felt like a hijacked vessel, heavy and exhausted, carrying a biological grenade that was going to detonate his already fractured life. Arthur dunked the mop into the bucket. The water was gray and murky, reeking of ammonia and harsh chemical pine. It burned his nostrils. That was the point. For an omega, pregnancy amplified the natural scent glands to a sickening degree. His biology was screaming for a nest, for safety, for a pack. Left unmasked, he smelled like crushed sugar and overripe figs, spiked with the sharp, panicked ozone of an omega without an alpha. It was a pathetic, loud scent. So Arthur used the strongest, most caustic cleaners the supply closet had to offer. He bathed his hands in bleach. He scrubbed the floors until his knees bruised, burying his own desperate pheromones under layers of toxic sterility. He wrung the mop out. The mechanism ground together with a wet, choking crunch. He hated this floor. The 84th floor. Executive row. The carpet in the offices was thick enough to swallow a shoe, and the glass walls offered panoramic views of the city's glowing grid. It was silent up here. Too silent. The kind of quiet that cost millions of dollars to maintain. Arthur pushed the bucket forward, ignoring the squeak, and shoved the heavy glass door of the corner office open with his shoulder. The air inside shifted. It was fainter now, 6 months stale, but the ghost of it still clung to the leather upholstery and the heavy mahogany desk. Cedar, cold rain, bitter espresso. Elias. Arthur's breath hitched, completely against his will. His core gave a traitorous, involuntary pulse. The baby rolled, settling deeper, soothed by the phantom trace of its sire. "Traitor," Arthur whispered, pressing his forearm against his stomach. He hated the physical reaction. He hated that his body remembered the heat of Elias's hands, the crushing weight of the Alpha's presence. It had been a mistake, a catastrophic, messy collision in a cramped server room during a blackout fueled by rut, heat, and mutual bitter resentment. They weren't lovers. Elias was the icy, untouchable architect of a corporate monopoly. Arthur was the guy who cleaned the toilets. They hadn't spoken before it happened. They hadn't spoken since. Arthur had slipped out before the emergency lights came back on, leaving nothing behind but a smear of blood on Elias's collar and a lie on his own lips. He started mopping near the door, keeping his eyes on the floor. The marble was immaculate, but he scrubbed it anyway. He scrubbed until his shoulders burned, trying to erase the scent of cedar with chemical pine, trying to erase the memory of Elias pinning him against a server rack tearing at his collar, burying his face in his neck with a raw, desperate noise that sounded almost like begging. Arthur's foot slipped on a wet patch. He stumbled, a heavy, ungraceful lurch, his hip colliding hard with the edge of a mahogany side table. Pain flared, sharp and bright. He dropped the mop. It hit the floor with a hollow clatter. Arthur grabbed the edge of the table, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the pain to recede, waiting for the baby to settle. He was just so tired. The exhaustion was a physical weight, heavier than the child, dragging him down toward the wet, chemical-smelling floor. "You missed a spot." Arthur flinched, his eyes snapping open. Brenda was standing in the doorway, a stack of manila folders clutched to her chest. She was 50-something, the head of payroll, and functionally ran the day-to-day misery of the middle floors. Her lipstick was faded, and her pantyhose had a run near the left knee. She looked exactly how Arthur felt. She wasn't looking at the floor. She was looking at the way his uniform shirt pulled tight across his stomach as he leaned over the table. Arthur straightened up slowly, his spine clicking. He kicked the mop handle up, catching it clumsily with one hand. "Floor's wet, Brenda. You shouldn't be in here." Brenda stepped into the room anyway, her sensible flat squeaking on the damp marble. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes dropping from his face to his waistline. The silence stretched. It wasn't the first time they'd played this game. For the past 2 months, as Arthur's condition became impossible to hide, the night staff had developed a sudden collective blindness. Greg at the security desk never looked at the monitors when Arthur was struggling to lift the heavy trash bags. Maria from maintenance started leaving the industrial floor buffer plugged in near the elevators, so Arthur wouldn't have to drag it down the hall. And Brenda, who handled the health insurance paperwork. Brenda, who knew exactly what day Elias had come to work with an uncharacteristic bruised bite mark on the side of his neck. "You look like hell, Artie," she said softly. "Thanks. It's the fluorescent lighting. Really washes out my complexion." Arthur didn't smile. He gripped the mop handle, his knuckles aching. Brenda sighed, a sound that came from the bottom of her lungs. She shifted the folders to one arm and dug into the pocket of her cardigan. She pulled out a small, foil-wrapped package and tossed it onto the mahogany side table. "Ginger snaps. My daughter sent them," Brenda lied smoothly. Her daughter lived in Seattle and hadn't called in 3 years. "Too spicy for my stomach. Thought you might want them. Helps with the nausea." Arthur stared at the foil packet. His throat felt tight. The urge to cry hit him, a sudden, violent spike of omega hormones that made his eyes burn. He bit the inside of his cheek hard enough to taste copper, forcing the tears back down. He wasn't going to cry in front of Brenda. He wasn't going to cry in Elias's office. "I'm not nauseous," Arthur said. His voice was hoarse. Brenda looked at him. Really looked at him. She saw the dark, bruised bags under his eyes, the pallor of his skin beneath the harsh lights. She smelled the suffocating reek of bleach, and beneath it, the faint, desperate distress of a pregnant omega trying to hide. "You're a terrible liar," she said matter-of-factly. "Eat the cookies, Arthur." She turned to leave, her flat squelching on the wet floor. She paused at the doorway, resting a hand on the frame. "He's in Tokyo," she said quietly, not looking back. "Supposed to be there until Friday. The whole floor is empty for the rest of the week." She didn't say Elias's name. She didn't have to. It was the open secret that breathed in the vents of the Reynolds building. The staff knew. They all knew. They saw the way Arthur avoided the CEO's private elevator. They smelled the faint clash of scents on the nights when Arthur had to clean this specific office. They were working-class people moving through a billionaire's playground. They survived by seeing everything and saying nothing. "Good to know," Arthur managed to say. "Thanks." Brenda nodded once and disappeared down the hall. Arthur was left alone with the squeaking bucket and the smell of pine. He reached out and touched the foil packet of ginger snaps. The foil was cool. He picked it up and shoved it into his oversized pocket, pressing his hand briefly against the hard lump of his stomach. "Just us," he whispered to the quiet room. He picked up the mop again. He had 2 more offices to clean before he could clock out, go back to his cramped, drafty apartment, and strip off the uniform that smelled like poison. He started scrubbing. He was halfway across the room when the low mechanical hum of the private elevator echoed through the silence of the 84th floor. Arthur froze. The mop slipped from his hands. The private elevator didn't ding. It announced its arrival with a soft, pneumatic hiss. Arthur's heart slammed into his ribs, a frantic, rabbit-fast rhythm that made the blood rush in his ears. He's in Tokyo. Brenda had said he was in Tokyo. It was Tuesday. Heavy, purposeful footsteps stepped off the carpeted elevator bay and onto the marble, the sound of wet leather shoes. Arthur stood paralyzed in the center of Elias's office. He couldn't move. His brain misfired, trapped between the instinct to flee and the heavy, lethargic reality of his pregnant body. He looked at the door. He looked at the closet. Neither was an option. The heavy glass door to the office swung open. Elias stopped in the doorway. He didn't look like a magazine cover. He looked like a man who had spent 14 hours on a plane and walked straight into a storm. His dark wool overcoat was soaked across the shoulders, dripping rainwater onto the pristine floor. His tie was loosened, the collar of his shirt unbuttoned. He looked exhausted, the lines around his mouth carved deep with fatigue. He was looking down at his phone, typing a message with his thumb. "I told you to delay the merger, David," Elias said, his voice a low, rough rumble that vibrated right into the marrow of Arthur's bones. "If they want to play hardball, let them bleed out for another quarter. I'm not—" Elias stopped speaking. He stopped typing. His head snapped up. The air in the room changed instantly. The sterile, conditioned atmosphere shattered. The scent of rain and cold cedar hit Arthur like a physical blow, heavy and suffocating. But beneath the cedar, sharp and aggressive, was the smell of ozone, lightning striking rock, the scent of an alpha whose territory had been breached. Elias's eyes, dark and dilated, locked onto Arthur. Arthur shrank back, instinctively raising a rubber-gloved hand to cover his stomach. It was a stupid, pointless gesture. He was wearing an oversized shirt, but the angle was wrong. The light was too bright. The swell of his abdomen was undeniable. For 3 agonizing seconds, neither of them moved. The only sound was the hum of the HVAC system and the slow, wet drip, drip, drip of rainwater falling from Elias's coat onto the marble. Elias's nostrils flared. He took a breath. Arthur watched the exact moment the Alpha's brain processed the information. Elias's eyes widened, a micro-expression of shock that was quickly swallowed by a violent, instinctual confusion. He smelled the industrial bleach first. His upper lip curled in disgust at the chemical burn. But Elias was an alpha. He could smell beneath the surface. He caught the scent of crushed sugar, overripe figs, the sour tang of fear sweat, and then he caught the scent of himself, faint, buried, but undeniably present beneath Arthur's skin. "What?" Elias breathed, his voice stripped of all corporate polish. It was a raw, jagged sound. "What is this?" He didn't mean the mop bucket. Arthur's throat clamped shut. He took a step back, his heel hitting the leg of the mahogany desk. "I'm just cleaning," he forced out. His voice shook. He hated that it shook. "I'm almost done." Elias dropped his phone. It hit the floor with a sharp crack, the screen splintering. He didn't look down. He stepped into the room, kicking the door shut behind him. The heavy glass sealed them in. "You," Elias said. He took another step forward. He wasn't walking like a CEO. He was walking like a predator that had just found something bleeding in its den. "It was you." "Stay back." Arthur's voice cracked. He reached blindly behind him, his fingers curling over the edge of the desk. He felt absurd. He was holding a wet mop and wearing yellow rubber gloves. He was a janitor, and he was carrying the heir to a multi-billion-dollar empire. 6 months, Elias said, his eyes dropping to Arthur's hands, which were pressed defensively over his belly. The Alpha's chest heaved. The scent of ozone spiked, thick enough to taste on the back of the tongue. It made the baby squirm wildly, kicking hard against Arthur's ribs. Arthur let out a sharp gasp, bending slightly at the waist. Elias was across the room before Arthur could blink. The Alpha didn't ask for permission. His hands were suddenly there, large and burning hot, gripping Arthur's upper arms to steady him. Elias was close, too close. The smell of cold rain and cedar wrapped around Arthur, drowning out the bleach, drowning out the pine. It was intoxicating. It was terrifying. "Look at me," Elias demanded. His voice was a low snarl, vibrating in his chest. Arthur looked up. Elias's face was inches away. The exhaustion was gone from the Alpha's eyes, replaced by a dark, possessive fever. Elias let go of one of Arthur's arms, his hand dropping slowly, agonizingly, toward the swell of Arthur's stomach. "Don't," Arthur hissed, slapping his gloved hand over Elias's wrist. Elias didn't stop. He pushed through Arthur's weak resistance with frightening ease. He pressed his palm flat against the tight, stretched fabric of the uniform shirt. The baby kicked instantly, right against Elias's palm. Elias flinched as if he'd been burned. He sucked in a harsh breath, his eyes closing for a fraction of a second. When he opened them, the pupil had completely blown out, turning his eyes entirely black. A low, vibrating growl started in the back of Elias's throat, a primitive sound of claim that bounced off the glass walls of the executive office. "Mine," Elias whispered, the word tearing out of him like a ripped seam. Arthur shoved him. He planted both hands on Elias's chest and pushed with all the strength he had left. Elias stumbled back half a step, more from shock than force. "Don't touch me," Arthur snapped, tearing off the yellow rubber gloves and throwing them onto the floor. His hands were shaking violently. "You don't get to come in here and growl at me. I'm doing my job." "Your job?" Elias stared at him, bewildered and furious. He gestured sharply to the mop bucket. "You're scrubbing floors? You're pregnant with my child and you're hauling toxic chemicals around at 2 a.m? "I have rent to pay, Elias," Arthur yelled back, the cynicism finally breaking through the panic. "Not all of us have private elevators. Some of us actually have to work." "You should have told me," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave, dangerous and tight. "You vanished. The security footage from the server room was corrupted. I didn't know who you were." "You didn't look very hard," Arthur shot back, his breathing ragged. "I empty your trash every Tuesday." Elias stared at him, the reality of the situation crashing down over the instinctual alpha haze, the cheap uniform, the exhaustion carving hollows into Arthur's cheeks, the fact that his staff, his security, his HR department, they must have known. They had let his pregnant Omega scrub the marble beneath their feet. Elias looked at the heavy trash bag sitting by the door. He looked at the bleach stains on Arthur's cheap sneakers. The scent of ozone shifted, turning darker, thicker. It wasn't just possessiveness anymore. It was rage. Pure, unadulterated fury. "Who knew?" Elias asked, his voice deadly quiet. Arthur swallowed hard, crossing his arms over his chest. "Leave them out of it." "Who knew?" Elias repeated, taking a slow step toward the door, his eyes locked on Arthur. "Who watched you carry my child and let you pick up a mop?" Arthur didn't answer. He backed up against the desk, the heavy weight in his stomach pulling at his spine. The sterile corporate office suddenly felt like a cage, and Elias was standing between him and the only way out. Part 4. The Glass Cage. The splintered screen of Elias's phone glowed on the wet marble, casting a fractured blue light against the toe of his ruined leather shoe. Arthur stared at it. It was easier to look at the broken technology than to look at the Alpha. The air in the office was becoming unbreathable. Elias's scent, ozone, wet earth, and cedar, was rolling off him in heavy, suffocating waves, entirely displacing the chemical burn of the floor cleaner. It was a physical pressure in the room. It made the fine hairs on Arthur's arms stand up, scraping against the damp cotton of his sleeves. "I asked you a question," Elias said. The rough vibration of his voice rattled the glass walls. "Who in this building knew?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Arthur lied, his voice tight. He grabbed the handle of the mop bucket, his knuckles popping. "I'm the night janitor. I clean the floors. That's it." He went to pull the bucket backward, a frantic instinct to retreat, to get the squeaking plastic wheels moving toward the door. Elias moved faster. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides and clamped his hand down on the plastic rim of the bucket. The water sloshed violently, gray and foaming, spilling over the edge to splatter onto Arthur's cheap canvas sneakers. "Let go!" Arthur snapped. "Stop running!" Elias countered, his grip on the bucket white-knuckled. He wasn't looking at Arthur's face. His dark, dilated eyes were fixed in a downward stare, locked entirely on the round, heavy curve of Arthur's stomach. The Alpha's chest rose and fell in ragged, uneven pulls. Arthur felt a sickening plunge in his gut. It was the terrifying vulnerability of being an Omega caught out in the open. His body, completely against his conscious will, betrayed him. His scent spiked, a sharp, sweet rush of crushed sugar and distress, a biological SOS that hit the confined space of the office like a flare gun. Elias let out a sound that wasn't human. It was a fractured, rattling inhale, his head jerking up. Before Arthur could step back, Elias let go of the bucket and gripped Arthur by the shoulders. The Alpha's hands were massive, burning hot through the fabric of the uniform. He pulled Arthur forward, not hard enough to hurt, but with an absolute, undeniable leverage. "Elias, stop!" Elias buried his face in the crook of Arthur's neck. Arthur froze. The fight drained out of his muscles, replaced by a heavy, paralyzing shock. Elias's nose dragged roughly against the sensitive skin, right over Arthur's pulse point. The Alpha inhaled deeply, a long, shuddering drag of breath that sucked the cold air right out of Arthur's lungs. Elias's wet wool overcoat pressed against Arthur's chest, soaking through the thin uniform shirt. The cold dampness contrasted violently with the fever heat of Elias's mouth breathing against his collarbone. "You smell like poison," Elias muttered into his skin, his voice thick and slurred with instinct. "You covered yourself in poison." "It's bleach," Arthur whispered. He squeezed his eyes shut, his hands hovering awkwardly in the air, refusing to touch the Alpha's back. "I work with bleach." "You hid." Elias's thumbs dug into the hollow of Arthur's shoulders. "You took my pup, and you hid on my payroll." "I didn't take anything," Arthur choked out, his cynicism finally clawing its way back to the surface. He shoved his forearms against Elias's chest, pushing back hard. "I left. There's a difference. Now back off." Elias resisted for a second, his jaw tightening, but he allowed himself to be pushed back. He looked completely unmoored. The sleek, untouchable architect of a corporate monopoly was gone. He was just a man standing in a puddle of dirty water, his tie crooked, staring at a pregnant janitor. A sharp rap on the glass door shattered the tension. Both men jumped. Brenda was standing in the hallway. She had a master key card in one hand and the stack of manila folders in the other. She swiped the card. The electronic lock beeped, and she pushed the heavy door open, stepping into the thick, pheromone-choked air of the office without a flinch. "The whole floor can hear you shouting, Mr. Reynolds," Brenda said flatly. Elias pivoted, his body instantly angling to put himself between Brenda and Arthur. It was a blind, primitive guarding reflex. His upper lip twitched, the scent of ozone spiking aggressively toward the intruder. "Get out," Elias ordered. Brenda didn't blink. She adjusted her grip on the folders. "You're back early from Tokyo, sir. If you need the office turned over, I can have Arthur finish his shift on floor 72. Elias stared at her, his brain clearly struggling to reconcile his corporate reality with the biological fire burning in his blood. He recognized her. "You're Brenda. Payroll." "Yes, sir." Elias's eyes narrowed, sweeping over her faded lipstick, the run in her pantyhose, and finally the calm, knowing look in her eyes. The puzzle pieces snapped together with a violent click. "You knew," Elias said. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You do the insurance processing. You knew he was carrying." Brenda stood her ground, though Arthur could see the slight tremor in the hand holding the folders. "I process the paperwork I'm given, Mr. Reynolds." "Don't talk to her like that," Arthur interjected, sidestepping Elias to put himself in the Alpha's line of sight. His back flared with a sharp shooting ache, but he ignored it. "She didn't do anything. None of them did. I just show up and clean the damn floors." Elias looked back at Arthur, the anger in his face fracturing again into that raw, desperate confusion. He looked from Arthur's pale, exhausted face to the heavy trash bag sitting by the door, then to the broken phone on the floor. "Shift's over," Elias said abruptly. Arthur blinked. "I have 2 more offices." "I don't care if the entire floor is covered in mud," Elias snapped, his voice rising, the controls slipping again. He pointed a long, shaking finger at the mop bucket. "You are never touching that thing again. You are leaving. Now." Part 5. The Descent. Arthur didn't argue. He didn't have the energy left. The adrenaline spike was crashing, leaving him hollowed out, his joints aching with the deep liquid fatigue. The baby, agitated by the screaming and the pheromones, was rolling relentlessly against his lower spine, a dull, grinding pressure that made Arthur want to sit down on the wet floor and never get up. He unclipped his ID badge from his belt and tossed it onto the mahogany desk. It landed next to the foil packet of ginger snaps. "Fine," Arthur said, his voice flat. "I'll get my coat." He walked past Elias, giving the Alpha a wide berth, and headed for the door. Elias followed him instantly, a dark, looming shadow at his heels. Arthur stepped out into the quiet hallway. Brenda gave him a tight, supportive nod before turning toward the stairwell, retreating from the firing line. Arthur didn't go toward the bank of sleek, mirrored elevators that serviced the executive floor. He turned left, heading down the narrow, dimly lit corridor that led to the service lift. "Where are you going?" Elias demanded, matching Arthur's slow, heavy pace effortlessly. "Basement," Arthur grunted, pressing his hand against his lower back. "Lockers are on sub-level 2. Use the main elevator." "My keycard doesn't work in the main elevators past midnight," Arthur replied, pressing the dented metal button for the service lift. It lit up with a dull, flickering orange halo. "Security protocols, remember? You signed off on them." Elias went rigidly silent. The heavy steel doors of the service lift groaned open. The interior was lined with scuffed moving blankets and smelled heavily of cardboard, industrial floor wax, and stale coffee. Arthur stepped in, leaning heavily against the back wall, letting the cold metal seep through his shirt. Elias hesitated at the threshold. He looked completely out of place in his tailored suit and wet wool coat, staring into the freight elevator like it was a descending cage. But the absolute refusal to let Arthur out of his sight overrode his hesitation. He stepped inside, the doors hammered shut, sealing them in a space roughly the size of a walk-in closet. The descent was slow and loud. The gears ground against each other, a rhythmic, mechanical shudder that vibrated through the floorboards. Arthur closed his eyes, tilting his head back against the wall. The silence between them was dense, heavier than the humidity in the box. He could feel Elias staring at him. He didn't need to open his eyes to know. The Alpha's gaze was a physical heat on his skin, tracking the harsh rise and fall of Arthur's chest, the dark bruises under his eyes, the way his hands rested instinctively on the lower curve of his belly. "You look—" Elias started, his voice rough, scraping against the quiet hum of the elevator. He stopped, unable to find the word. "Like I mop floors for a living?" Arthur offered, not opening his eyes. "Exhausted," Elias corrected quietly. "You look sick." "It's just the 3rd trimester, Elias," Arthur said, the cynicism wearing thin, revealing the raw, frayed nerves beneath. "It's not glowing skin and morning yoga. It's swollen ankles, Heartburn that feels like battery acid, and passing out on the subway. I'm fine. Elias flinched. Arthur heard the sharp intake of breath. You take the subway? Arthur finally opened his eyes, turning his head to look at the Alpha. Yes, the G train. It's very glamorous. Elias stared at him, a muscle ticking hard in his jaw. The scent of ozone flared again, bitter and metallic with guilt. Arthur, why didn't you come to me after the blackout? You just vanished. You left me bleeding in the server room. You weren't bleeding. I bit your collarbone, Arthur corrected dryly. He shifted his weight, wincing as a sharp pain lanced through his hip. And I didn't come to you because you're the CEO. You're Elias Reynolds. I was a temp who got hired full-time 2 weeks prior. It was a mistake. You were in rut. I was nearby. It wasn't supposed to be anything. You're carrying my child, Elias said, the words heavy, tasting them on his tongue for the first time. I'm carrying a consequence, Arthur said coldly. It was a lie, a defense mechanism, but he needed the armor. And I was handling it. By scrubbing my floors? Elias stepped closer, the confined space making the movement feel overwhelmingly large. By letting my staff watch you drag toxic chemicals around while you're carrying my air? Don't call it that. Arthur's voice cracked, a sudden flare of panic breaking through the exhaustion. It's not an air. It's just a baby. My baby. The elevator jolted to a stop, the loud mechanical bell dinging for sublevel 2. The doors groaned open, revealing the concrete walls and exposed pipes of the basement. Arthur pushed off the wall and walked out, desperate to escape the heavy, cloying scent of the Alpha. Part 6. The rusted lockers. The basement was freezing. The air was damp and smelled of grease, wet concrete, and the cheap synthetic pine soap from the staff showers. Fluorescent strip lights hummed loudly overhead, casting a sickly, green-tinged light over the rows of dented metal lockers. Arthur walked down the third aisle, his shoes squeaking against the painted concrete floor. He stopped in front of locker 42, his fingers clumsy as he spun the combination dial. Elias stood at the end of the aisle, a dark sentinel watching his every move. The locker door squealed on rusted hinges. Inside hung Arthur's worn navy blue winter coat, a threadbare scarf, and a pair of faded jeans. He didn't want to do this in front of Elias. He didn't want to peel off the oversized uniform shirt. It was his only armor, but the wet fabric was clinging to his skin, making him shiver in the subterranean chill. Arthur turned his back to the Alpha. He unbuttoned the stiff gray cotton, his fingers trembling slightly. He pulled it off his shoulders and let it drop to the floor. Beneath the uniform, he was wearing a cheap, white-ribbed undershirt. It was meant to be tight, but on his pregnant frame it was stretched to its absolute breaking point, clinging ruthlessly to the hard, basketball-sized swell of his stomach. The fabric was sheer enough to show the dark, bruised line of the linea nigra running down the center of his belly. A sharp, ragged sound echoed from the end of the aisle. Arthur didn't turn around. He pulled his navy coat off the hanger and shoved his arms into the sleeves, hastily trying to pull the fabric across his front. The coat didn't zip anymore. It hadn't zipped in a month. He grabbed his keys and slammed the locker shut. When he turned, Elias was right there. The Alpha had crossed the distance silently. His eyes were entirely black, blown wide, fixed on the gap in Arthur's coat where the white undershirt pulled tight over the baby. The restraint Elias was exercising was visible. It looked like physical agony. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, trembling with the sheer force of holding himself back from touching, from claiming, from covering the Omega with his own scent. "Move," Arthur said. His voice was breathless, lacking any real authority. Elias didn't step aside. He reached out slowly, his fingers uncurling. He caught the lapel of Arthur's cheap winter coat, his knuckles brushing against Arthur's collarbone. The touch was burning hot. "I have a car waiting upstairs," Elias said. His voice was a low rumble, rough with possessiveness. "Good for you," Arthur muttered, trying to pull away. I have a bus to catch. You're not taking the bus, Arthur. The grip on the lapel tightened, just a fraction. Not aggressive, but absolute. It's raining. It's 3 in the morning. You are getting in the car. I don't want your car. Arthur shoved at Elias's chest, but the Alpha didn't budge an inch. I'm going home, to my apartment, where you don't exist, that reality, Elias said quietly, leaning in until his mouth was inches from Arthur's ear, the smell of cedar drowning out the basement damp. Ended 20 minutes ago. Arthur let out a frustrated noise, pushing past Elias's shoulder. The Alpha let him go, trailing a hand down Arthur's arm as he passed. They walked in silence toward the loading dock exit, the only doors that opened to the street from the sub-levels. The heavy steel door pushed open to reveal a wall of cold, driving rain. The alleyway was slick and black, illuminated by the harsh glare of street lamps. Idling at the curb, rain beating a relentless tattoo against its glossy black roof, was a Maybach. A driver in a dark suit stood by the rear passenger door, holding a massive black umbrella. Arthur stopped beneath the concrete overhang of the loading dock. The wind bit through his open coat, making him shiver violently. He looked down the alley. The bus stop was 3 blocks away, a miserable, unsheltered bench in the pouring rain. His feet throbbed in his wet canvas sneakers, a dull, pulsing agony that shot all the way up to his swollen lower back. He looked at the Maybach. He looked at the bus stop. Pride is a luxury you can't afford right now, Elias said, stepping up right behind him. The Alpha's broad shoulders blocked the wind. He didn't touch Arthur, but his body heat radiated outward, an undeniable magnetic warmth. Get in the car. Arthur closed his eyes. The baby kicked, a slow, heavy roll against his bladder that made him bite his lip. He was so tired. The fight was leaking out of him, washing down the storm drain with the rainwater. He opened his eyes, glaring at the sleek, ridiculously expensive vehicle. If that leather seat heater isn't on, Arthur grumbled, his voice thick with defeat and exhaustion, I'm biting you again. Elias let out a sharp, breathless sound that might have been a laugh, though it held no humor. It sounded more like relief. Thomas, Elias called out over the rain. Turn the heat up. Arthur stepped out from under the concrete overhang, ignoring the umbrella the driver held out, and slid awkwardly into the sprawling, cavernous back seat of the car. The leather was soft, butter-smooth, and radiating a deep, sinking warmth. It smelled like expensive cologne and sterile air. Elias slid in right behind him, the heavy door thudding shut, instantly cutting off the sound of the storm. The silence in the cabin was total, heavy, and expectant. Arthur leaned his head against the tinted glass, staring out at the blurred, wet concrete of the alleyway. The engine purred, a vibration felt rather than heard, and the car pulled smoothly away from the Reynolds building. He was in the Alpha's cage now. And as Elias's warm hand slid tentatively, inevitably, across the leather seat to rest against Arthur's thigh, Arthur realized the hardest part wasn't going to be fighting the CEO. It was going to be fighting his own body's desperate, treacherous relief. The Maybach's tires hissed over the wet asphalt, a sound of expensive engineering insulating them from the violent storm outside. Arthur stared at the privacy divider separating them from the driver, Thomas. The screen was black and opaque. It felt like being trapped inside a very luxurious coffin. Beside him, Elias hadn't moved. The Alpha's hand remained resting flat on the leather seat, exactly 1 inch away from Arthur's thigh. The heat radiating from Elias's knuckles was a magnetic pull, dragging at Arthur's frayed nerves. His omega biology, the traitorous, desperate core of him, screamed to bridge that gap, to lean into the broad shoulder, to bury his face in the damp, rain-soaked wool of Elias's coat and inhale the heavy territorial scent of cedar and ozone until he passed out. Arthur gritted his teeth, digging his fingernails into his palms. He kept his spine rigid against the buttery leather, his eyes fixed dead ahead. Turn right on 43rd, Arthur said, his voice sandpaper dry. It's the brick walk-up next to the 24-hour laundromat. Elias didn't verbally relay the instruction. He just tapped a sequence on the armrest console. The car glided into a seamless turn. The neighborhood changed. The towering glass monoliths of the financial district bled into the cramped, low-slung concrete of Deep Queens. The streetlights flickered here, casting jaundiced yellow pools over overflowing trash cans and chained-up bicycles. The Maybach looked grotesque, parked against the curb of Arthur's building. It was a spaceship landed in a slum. Arthur reached for the door handle. Elias's hand shot out, wrapping around Arthur's wrist. The grip was loose, easily broken, but the sheer heat of it paralyzed Arthur's arm. "Wait," Elias commanded softly. Thomas was already out of the car. He opened Arthur's door, holding a massive black umbrella that shielded them entirely from the freezing rain. Arthur stepped out. His canvas sneakers immediately sank into an inch of oily puddle water. The cold shocked his system, shooting a dull ache straight up his shins to his swollen knees. He let out a harsh, involuntary breath, grabbing the roof of the car to steady himself. Elias slid out right behind him, ignoring the umbrella. The rain immediately plastered the Alpha's dark hair to his forehead. He didn't seem to notice. His dark eyes were busy scanning the cracked facade of the building, the flickering security light, the broken glass in the front door. The scent of ozone flared, sharp and violently protective, tasting like a copper penny on the back of Arthur's tongue. "I live on the 5th floor," Arthur said flatly, pulling his coat tighter around his distended stomach. "There's no elevator. Go home, Elias." "Lead the way," Elias replied, his voice a low, immovable vibration. Arthur didn't have the energy to argue. His lower back was a tight, burning knot of pain. He turned and pushed through the heavy, water-warped front door of the building. The lobby smelled like boiled cabbage, wet dog, and decades of stale cigarette smoke. The overhead fluorescent tube buzzed with the agitated frequency of an angry hornet. Arthur started up the stairs. The rubber treads were peeling away from the concrete. The first flight was routine. By the third flight, Arthur's breathing grew ragged. The baby felt like a boulder resting on his pelvis, grinding against his hip joints with every step. He paused on the landing between the 3rd and 4th floors, leaning heavily against the peeling beige paint of the wall, pressing both hands beneath his belly to lift the weight. He closed his eyes, dragging air into his burning lungs. He heard Elias step up onto the landing behind him. The Alpha's wet leather shoes made a soft, squelching sound. Elias stopped, leaving exactly 2 feet of space between them. "Don't," Arthur wheezed, anticipating the pity, anticipating the overbearing Alpha command to carry him. "Don't say a word." "I wasn't going to," Elias said quietly. Arthur opened his eyes and looked over his shoulder. Elias was staring at the wall, his jaw locked so tight, the muscle twitched visibly beneath the skin. He looked furious, not at Arthur, but at the stairs, at the building, at the fact that this was the reality his pregnant Omega had been navigating while he drank aged scotch in an 84th floor office. Arthur pushed off the wall and tackled the last 2 flights. By the time he jammed his bent brass key into the deadbolt of apartment 5B, his hands were shaking so badly he dropped the keys twice. Elias picked them up the second time, his large, warm fingers brushing over Arthur's icy ones. The Alpha unlocked the door and pushed it open. Arthur stepped inside and flipped the light switch. The apartment was a single room, technically a studio, but that implied a level of design that this box lacked. It was 300 square feet of uneven linoleum, a rusted radiator that clanked loudly in the corner, and a small kitchenette where the grout was permanently stained yellow from grease. It smelled intensely of bleach. Arthur watched Elias step over the threshold. The Alpha looked too large for the room. His broad shoulders seemed to crowd the narrow hallway, his head clearing the popcorn ceiling by a mere handful of inches. Elias stood perfectly still, his eyes taking in the sagging thrift store armchair, the stack of past-due bills on the tiny laminate counter, and finally the mattress on the floor in the corner. "Take your shoes off," Arthur muttered, leaning against the counter to pry his wet sneakers off his swollen feet. He couldn't bend all the way over. He had to wedge the toe of one shoe against the heel of the other, grunting with the effort. Before he could finish, Elias was kneeling in front of him. Arthur froze. The CEO of Reynolds Global, a man who regularly dined with senators and dismantled international conglomerates before lunch, was kneeling on the sticky linoleum of a Queens slum. Elias didn't look up. He simply grasped Arthur's left ankle with one large hot hand and gently slipped the wet, dirty canvas sneaker off his foot. He placed it neatly by the door, then did the same with the right. Elias stayed kneeling for a long moment, staring at Arthur's feet. They were painfully swollen, the cheap white cotton socks cutting deep, red indents into his ankles. "I need to use the bathroom," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. The vulnerability of the moment was entirely too much. It was suffocating him faster than the alpha's scent. Elias let go of his ankle and stood up, stepping back to give Arthur space. "Go!" Arthur hurried into the tiny freezing bathroom, shutting the flimsy door and locking it. He leaned over the chipped porcelain sink, turning on the cold water. It spat out rusty brown for 3 seconds before running clear. He splashed it on his face, shivering as the icy drops ran down his neck. He looked at himself in the mirrored medicine cabinet. The glass was heavily de-silvered around the edges. He looked like a ghost. Dark, violet bruises hung under his eyes. His skin was translucent, stretched tight over his cheekbones. He looked down at the massive, heavy curve of his belly pushing against the damp fabric of his undershirt. "What are we doing?" he asked the mirror, resting a hand on the swell. A sharp, rolling kick answered him, bruising his bladder. "Yeah, I know." He stayed in the bathroom for 10 minutes, sitting on the closed lid of the toilet, just breathing in the scent of his own cheap synthetic pine soap, trying to build the walls back up. He had survived the last 6 months by being a ghost, by being cynical, cold, and untouchable. He couldn't let Elias dismantle that armor just because the alpha knew how to take off a shoe. When Arthur finally unlocked the door and stepped out, the apartment was completely silent. Elias was standing in the center of the room, staring at the mattress on the floor. He had taken off his wet overcoat and draped it over the back of the single chair. He had also removed his suit jacket, rolling up the sleeves of his crisp, white button-down to the elbows. The shirt was wrinkled and the tie was gone. But it was what Elias was staring at that made Arthur's stomach drop. The mattress wasn't just a bed. In the weeks following his second trimester, Arthur's biology had forcibly demanded a nest. A safe, heavily scented place to prepare for the pup. But Arthur had no alpha. He had no pack. He had no safe place. So, he had built a nest out of survival and distress. It was a pathetic, chaotic circle made of a scratchy, government-issue gray wool blanket, 2 thin towels, and a pile of his own worn-out laundry. It smelled sour. It smelled like the fear sweat of a lonely omega, heavily masked by the burning chemical scent of industrial bleach that Arthur used to scrub his skin in the shower. It was an anti-nest, a monument to isolation. Elias was staring at it with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. The alpha's chest was heaving. The scent of ozone had vanished entirely, replaced by the suffocating, heavy smell of wet earth and crushed pine needles, the scent of an alpha in deep, agonizing distress. Elias slowly turned to look at Arthur. His dark eyes were glassy, hollowed out by the sheer biological wrongness of what he was looking at. "You sleep in that," Elias said. It wasn't a question, it was a condemnation. "It's a bed, Elias. It's fine." Arthur crossed his arms over his stomach defensively, suddenly hyper-aware of how cold the room was. The draft rattling the window pane bit through his thin undershirt. "It smells like panic." Elias took a step toward Arthur, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "It smells like bleach and pain. There is nothing in there to comfort you. There is nothing to comfort the pup." "I don't have anything else," Arthur snapped, his temper flaring, a sudden bright burst of anger to mask the crushing embarrassment. "I don't have a silk duvet, Elias. I don't have cashmere. I have whatever is clean on laundry day. So excuse me if my biological coping mechanism isn't up to your aesthetic standards." "That's not what I mean," Elias growled, closing the distance between them. He didn't stop until he was inches away. Arthur had to tilt his head back to look him in the eye. An omega is supposed to nest with the scent of their alpha, Elias said, his voice vibrating with a primal, territorial ache. They are supposed to be surrounded by it, bathed in it. It tells your nervous system that you are protected, that the pup is safe. He reached out, his warm fingers barely grazing the side of Arthur's neck, right over the scent gland that had been scrubbed raw with soap. You have been fighting your own biology for 6 months. You're running on empty. Arthur swallowed hard. The touch was agonizingly gentle. I survived. Surviving is living, Arthur. Elias stepped past him. He walked over to the armchair and picked up his discarded suit jacket. The garment was bespoke, heavy, dark charcoal wool, imbued deeply with the alpha's natural scent. Elias walked to the mattress. With a single fluid motion, he threw the cheap gray blanket off the bed. He dropped his suit jacket right in the center of the nest. The reaction in Arthur's body was violent and instantaneous. The heavy, rich scent of cedar, bitter espresso, and ozone hit the air. It rolled over Arthur like a physical wave of heat. His knees buckled. It wasn't a choice. It was an absolute neurological override. The deep, gnawing anxiety that had lived in his chest for half a year, a constant, vibrating hum of danger, suddenly evaporated. The baby kicked wildly, a rapid sequence of rolls that felt entirely different from the heavy, bruised thuds of the past month. It was an excited, settling flutter. Arthur let out a choked gasp, grabbing the edge of the laminate kitchen counter to keep from hitting the linoleum. Elias was at his side in a microsecond. The alpha caught him around the waist, his large hand spreading wide over Arthur's lower back, taking the bulk of the pregnant omega's weight. I've got you, Elias murmured, his mouth pressed against Arthur's temple. I've got you. Let go. Arthur fought it for 3 seconds. He gripped the counter, his knuckles white, his cynical mind screaming at him not to give in, not to become another dependent, pathetic omega relying on a billionaire alpha who had only noticed him by accident. But he was so tired. The cold was sinking into his bones, and the smell of cedar was promising a warmth he hadn't felt in months. Arthur let go of the counter. He collapsed against Elias's chest. The alpha scooped him up entirely, lifting him off the sticky floor with frightening ease. Elias walked the 3 steps to the mattress and sat down, keeping Arthur securely in his lap. Arthur didn't fight him. He turned his face into the curve of Elias's neck, burying his nose against the pulse point just below the collar of the white shirt. He breathed in, deep, shuddering drags of air that filled his lungs with cedar. Elias wrapped his arms around Arthur, pulling the charcoal suit jacket from the mattress and draping it over Arthur's shaking shoulders. He cocooned him in it, burying the omega in his scent. They sat on the floor of the freezing queen's apartment, the only sound the clanking of the rusted radiator and the harsh, ragged breathing of 2 men who had been entirely broken by their own pride. Elias's hand moved down, tentatively resting over the sheer, stretched fabric of Arthur's undershirt. He flattened his palm over the heavy curve of the baby. This time, Arthur didn't push him away. He placed his own bruised, raw hand over Elias's, interlacing their fingers over their child. Tomorrow, Elias said, his voice a low, rumbling anchor against Arthur's ear. We pack this apartment. You are never scrubbing another floor. I'm not moving into your penthouse, Elias, Arthur muttered against the alpha's neck, the cynicism still there, though entirely muffled by exhaustion. I'm not a trophy to hide in a glass tower. You're not a trophy, Elias agreed, his thumb stroking slowly over the back of Arthur's hand. You're my partner, and we will figure out what that means. But you are not staying here. I'm not letting my pup be born in a room that smells like bleach and despair. Compromise, Arthur whispered, his eyelids dragging down, heavy as lead. The adrenaline crash was total. The warmth of the suit jacket and the solid wall of Elias's chest were pulling him down into the darkest, most restful sleep he had felt in months. Anything you want, Elias promised, burying his face in Arthur's messy hair. Just sleep. Arthur let his eyes close. For the first time in his life, he didn't set an alarm for the morning shift. The light that filtered through the cracked plastic blinds at 9 a.m. was gray, watery, and harsh. Arthur woke up slowly, surfacing through thick, heavy layers of a sleep so deep it felt narcotic. The first thing he registered was the heat. He was sweating slightly. A damp warmth pooled at the small of his back. He opened his eyes. He was lying sideways on the mattress. The heavy charcoal suit jacket was tucked securely around his shoulders, smelling overwhelmingly of cedar and safety. He shifted, expecting the usual sharp pain in his pelvis. It was still there, a dull ache, but the frantic, vibrating anxiety that usually accompanied his waking hours was gone. The baby was entirely still, resting peacefully against the lower curve of his stomach. Arthur turned his head. Elias was sitting on the floor next to the mattress. His back was resting against the peeling beige wall. The alpha's legs were stretched out over the linoleum, clad in ruined, wrinkled suit trousers. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the faint silver scar of the bite mark Arthur had left on his neck 6 months ago. Elias's head was tilted back against the wall, his eyes closed. He looked exhausted, older, the sharp angles of his face softened by sleep and the harsh morning light. Arthur watched him for a long time. He waited for the panic to set in. He waited for the cynical voice in his head to tell him that this was a mistake, that the alpha would wake up, realize the reality of a bitter, pregnant janitor in a dirty apartment, and walk out the door. But the air in the room didn't smell like regret. It smelled heavily, permanently, of claim. Arthur shifted, the plastic cover of the mattress crinkling loudly. Elias's eyes snapped open instantly. The protective instinct was a physical snap in the room, his dark eyes instantly locking onto Arthur, scanning him for distress. "You're awake," Elias rasped, his voice thick with sleep. He rubbed a hand roughly over his jaw, where a dark shadow of stubble had grown in. He shifted his weight, wincing as his spine cracked in protest against the hard floor. "How do you feel?" "Like I swallowed a bowling ball," Arthur replied honestly, pulling the suit jacket tighter around himself. He sat up slowly, using his elbow for leverage. "And like I slept for a decade," Elias watched him sit up, a complex tapestry of relief and lingering anger playing across his face. He pushed himself off the floor, his tall frame looming in the small space, though he deliberately kept his posture relaxed, non-threatening. "I'm going to make coffee," Elias said. He looked toward the kitchenette, eyeing the stained grout and the single chipped mug sitting by the sink. "Assuming you have any." "Top cabinet, left of the sink. It's instant," Arthur warned, swinging his swollen legs over the edge of the mattress. His feet hit the cold floor. "Don't expect miracles." Elias walked into the tiny kitchen. He looked entirely absurd standing there, a multi-billionaire trying to figure out how to boil water on a rusted electric hot plate. Arthur watched him, a strange tight knot forming in his chest. It wasn't love. Love was a fairy tale concept for people who didn't spend their nights mopping up other people's messes. But it was something heavy, something permanent. "Brenda called," Elias said, his back to Arthur as he spooned a mound of terrible brown powder into the mug. Arthur froze. "You answered my phone?" "It was ringing. I didn't want it to wake you." Elias turned the knob on the hot plate. It clicked 3 times before the coil began to glow a dull, angry orange. "She wanted to know if you were coming in for the Friday shift." Arthur stared at his own hands, resting on the swell of his belly. "What did you tell her?" Elias turned around, leaning his hips against the low counter. He crossed his arms over his chest, fixing Arthur with a look that was entirely CEO. Sharp, calculating, but underlined with a raw, undeniable possessiveness. "I told her that Arthur, the night janitor, formally resigned effective immediately," Elias said smoothly. Arthur's head snapped up, his temper immediately flaring. "You don't get to quit my job for me, Elias. I told you last night I am not going to be a kept omega sitting in a penthouse waiting for an allowance." "Let me finish," Elias interrupted, his voice raising just a fraction, a gentle command that vibrated in the air. I told her Arthur the janitor resigned. I then informed HR that the Reynolds Global Archives Department on the second floor is entirely understaffed. They require a lead archivist. The position requires sitting at a desk, reviewing old server data, and doing absolutely zero heavy lifting. Arthur blinked, the anger stalling in his throat. The pay is triple what you were making, Elias continued, turning back to pour the boiling water into the mug. The smell of cheap burned coffee filled the room. The health insurance is premium, and the archives department is completely isolated. You won't have to deal with the executives. You won't have to deal with me during business hours, unless you choose to. Elias picked up the mug and walked back to the mattress. He crouched down and held the coffee out. Arthur looked at the mug. He looked at Elias's face. There was no pity there. There was only a cold, calculated negotiation. Elias was giving him exactly what he needed, security and independence, while entirely removing the physical danger of his current life. It was a brilliant corporate maneuver applied to a messy biological reality. Arthur reached out and took the mug. Their fingers brushed. The spark of heat was undeniable, a sudden jolt that made the baby give a soft, rolling kick. Elias's eyes dropped to Arthur's stomach, a sudden softness fracturing his harsh expression. "Is this a bribe?" Arthur asked, taking a sip of the coffee. It tasted like ash and copper. He loved it. "It's a compromise," Elias corrected, sitting down on the edge of the mattress next to him. He didn't ask for permission this time. He reached out and rested his large hand firmly over the curve of Arthur's belly. "You keep your independence. I get to know you aren't carrying my child while dragging toxic chemicals around at 3 in the morning." Arthur stared into the black, muddy depths of the instant coffee. He leaned into Elias's side, letting his shoulder rest against the alpha's arm. "Fine," Arthur muttered. "But if the archive room smells like bleach, I'm quitting." Elias let out a low, rumbling sound that was half laugh, half growl. He leaned down, pressing his mouth against the crown of Arthur's head, breathing in the scent of crushed sugar and fading distress. "I'll have them rip up the carpets," Elias promised. They sat together on the floor of the terrible Queen's apartment, the CEO and the former janitor, surrounded by the smell of cheap coffee, old linoleum, and the heavy, unbreakable scent of cedar and ozone. The battle was over. The messy, complicated war of their new reality had just begun. But as Arthur felt the baby settle into a deep, rhythmic sleep against his spine, completely soothed by the alpha's presence, he realized that for the first time in 6 months, he wasn't fighting alone. He took another sip of the terrible coffee, let out a long, exhausted sigh, and leaned fully into the warmth of the alpha's chest. "Go pack a bag," Elias murmured against his hair. "The car's waiting." Arthur didn't argue. He just closed his eyes and let the scent of cedar wash away the last remnants of the bleach. And that is exactly why you never underestimate the quiet ones in the background. Arthur's journey from scrubbing floors to finding his power and making Elias work for his redemption is the kind of gritty, grounded Omegaverse drama we live for. If this raw emotional conclusion hit you right in the feels, you need to smash that like button right now. Share this story with everyone who loves complex characters and real-world stakes. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment below. What department would you demand to run if you were in Arthur's shoes? See you in the next one.